This is a Squiz podcast. We're your shortcut to being informed.
It's more and more challenging for the public and for our journalists and anyone to try and work out what really is going on.
How to react when a child say, yeah, but they deserved it, killed for a satirical drawing.
And we've had attacks. We've had people come into our offices to threaten journalists in one place.
Media literacy should be something that is considered a basic literacy, a core literacy alongside reading and writing and counting. The ability to check whether what you're reading is actually true.
Welcome to The Big Threat, a podcast about the global information wars and how mis and disinformation are eroding the democracies we live in. I'm Bryce Corbett. In this podcast series, join me on a trip around the world to meet the experts taking up the fight against fake news in what has become a race against time. Journalists, academics, government officials and educators, all working their corners of the globe to foster the critical thinking skills that will enable their populations to separate online fact from fiction, one of the defining challenges of the digital age. In this episode, I visit France, where journalists have launched a program teaching high school kids to filter content they see on social media, where a government agency ensures the nation's teachers are trained to teach media literacy, and where a shocking terror attack in 2015 galvanised a nation against disinformation. This is The Big Threat. There's a mural on a wall of a building in Paris's 11th arrondissement. In black and white and under the words "Je suis Charlie" are painted the faces of journalists and cartoonists murdered in a 2015 terrorist attack that shook France and reverberated around the world. Just before midday on January 7, two gunmen stormed the central Paris offices of the satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo, murdering 12 people and injuring 11 others.
These journalists ran to the roof of their building after gunshots ran out from the nearby offices of Charlie Hebdo. Two men had stepped out of a black Citroën. First, they shot dead Frédéric Boisseau, a building maintenance worker, and then stormed the second floor of Charlie Hebdo's offices during a morning editorial meeting. They killed Charb, the editor-in-chief, as well as cartoonists Wolinski, Tinius, Cabu, two other members of staff, and a man who, by unhappy chance, was visiting that day. This in a military-style attack.
The attacks were in response to the magazine publishing caricatures mocking the Prophet Muhammad. And in the days that followed, there were mass rallies across the country as millions of French took to the streets to defend freedom of speech.
In Paris today, a show of solidarity on this day of defiance. Under unprecedented security, more than 1 million people marching together, including leaders from across the globe. Officials declared this the largest rally in the French capital ever. Tonight, that country remains on edge and on alert, haunted by this past week's deadly shootings. The French Prime Minister... Behind banners declaring "Je suis Charlie" or "I am Charlie," world leaders, including Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu and Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, joined the march, helping to mark what would be a watershed moment in the history of France. It's now 10 years later, and almost to the day, that I arrive in Paris for the next instalment of my Churchill Fellowship travels, to learn how other countries are tackling the rise of mis and disinformation, and specifically, to see how those lessons might be applied to Newshounds, the digital literacy program my colleagues and I at the Squiz have developed. Last episode, I was in Estonia and Finland. Now, I'm back in the city I was lucky enough to call home for 10 years in the noughties. I lived and worked here in Paris from the year 2000 to 2010. And if 10 years living in France taught me anything, it's that France has a rich history of valuing the written word. Journalism in France is a very serious profession, a vital contributor to the rich intellectual life of the country. It's little wonder then that France takes very seriously any threat to the way information is disseminated and consumed.
And so, as I make my way on a late January morning to the headquarters of Agence France Presse, otherwise known as AFP, I'm fascinated to hear what Sophie Nicholson, the Deputy Director of AFP's fact-checking operation, has to say. AFP is France's government-funded newswire and broadcast service. It has some 1,700 journalists working for it around the world, in bureau in some of the most far-flung countries. And it's one of the most trusted sources of news and information in the world. Since 2017, they've had a fact-checking unit. It started with only 3 people, but at its peak, grew to more than 150 around the world. Until this year, when Mark Zuckerberg decided he was no longer interested in having professionals fact-check content on his platforms. Facebook was one of AFP's fact-checking unit's major clients.
Ok, bonjour à tous.
I'm invited to attend a morning editorial meeting of the Paris-based fact-checking team, where the day's fact-checks are discussed and decided upon.
Il n'y a pas Charlotte ce matin, donc on commence direct par la France. N'hésitez pas à me dire s'il y a des choses qui restent en suspens, des relectures notamment par exemple.
When Sophie and I meet in Paris in January, the decision by Meta to suspend fact-checking on Facebook and Instagram is still too recent for its implications to be fully known. So I catch up with her a couple of months later and ask if the impact has started to be felt.
At the moment, the team has slightly shrunk since the decision by Meta at the start of the year to stop fact-checking operations in the United States. We have over 100 people globally. But yeah, the US team has slightly shrunk, and things have got really challenging since the election of this Trump administration and the amount of false information that is being shared extremely widely by many people in that administration now. So it's extra challenging for the US team, and we're trying to help from other parts of the world as well where possible.
That help is coming in part from the 130 people AFP employs around the world to fact-check stories on social media in an impressive 26 different languages. But as widespread as this effort is, I find myself wondering exactly how much of a counterbalance it provides to the vast amount of mis- and disinformation that gets shared online on any given day.
I mean, obviously, yeah, it is a drop in the ocean. And it's not only is it extremely challenging now, and since I've been doing this, it's just got more and more challenging, particularly, as I said, with more and more politicians very consciously not caring at all about any element of evidence in what they're talking about, very, very deliberately spreading propaganda or manipulating images very simply. I haven't even talked about AI-generated tools, but there's still an enormous amount of very simple visual manipulation that is being used and spread very far and can have an impact. So, yeah, it's extremely challenging, frustrating, and at the same time, obviously, we think it's even more necessary than ever because it's more and more challenging for the public and for our journalists and anyone to try and work out what really is going on.
And that's, I guess, something that struck me. I mean, does it feel sometimes like a one-sided battle? I mean, if you think about it, takes a lot of time and an enormous amount of resources to investigate and establish the truth, and yet it costs nothing to create and spread a lie.
Yeah, it does. And sometimes you get a politician who might correct the record, or you see little results that show that there is something we're very slowly contributing to that we think is very valuable. So, I mean, that's what keeps us going. But yes, in the big picture, it is incredibly frustrating.
And exhausting if, as you say, fact checkers themselves are often the target of I imagine you're talking about trolls, people who are offended that they would seek to disprove a piece of mis or disinformation.
So, yeah, we do get regular trolls who are just not happy that we're correcting the record on a specific issue, that they don't want to see that. And we've had attacks. We've had people come into our offices to threaten journalists in one place. We've had campaigns, quite nasty attacks. I mean, if we have to, we report things to the police if it sounds like a threat. But yeah, there's doxing of fact checkers. It's a very difficult job. I mean, it's difficult for journalists, but fact checkers can be particularly targeted because they're obviously seen as being linked to a specific argument at a specific point in time. And so it's really important that we tell them, and the way that we write our stories is to be as factual and as explanatory as possible so that anyone who actually reads it can make their own decision about what we're writing.
And what impact has Meta's announcement that it's removing fact checkers from its platforms had on the fact-checking operations at AFP? And what are the longer-term implications for that, do you think?
Well, it was incredibly depressing when that announcement happened, because in terms of the size of Meta and the cost of the operations globally for fact-checking, I don't think I think it's not a very big cost, but yet the impact in helping fact-checkers to do their work, it was significant. So for AFP, we're lucky we're a large organization. We're not one small fact-checking organization. There are certain organizations that may actually close because of that decision. And the whole fact-checking operation with Meta did seem to be producing some results. I mean, we wouldn't have kept doing it if we didn't see that. And yet, for that to finish, it just, it's a blow. It's not going to stop us doing our work, but it is very, very depressing.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I was reflecting upon the announcement that Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg made at the time. And he said in that announcement, and I quote, "Fact checkers have become too politically biased and have destroyed more trust than they've created." What's your response to that?
It was very surprising to hear that, because up until that point, we'd only had extremely positive feedback from Meta's side from what we were doing. And to me, that's just a reflection of something that someone had told Mark Zuckerberg that he was repeating. There definitely has been pushback from conservatives in the United States about fact-checking operations. And there have been studies that have shown that the part of the reason for that is perhaps there was more content created by conservatives that was fact-checked because there was more incorrect information in that, or it was being pushed more. Obviously, there's incorrect information and disinformation campaigns on every side, but there was definitely a lot of pressure from the administration on platforms and including Zuckerberg, and it definitely sounded that way.
How important is fact-checking, especially around time of elections?
I think that's one of the times where it is incredibly important, because there is more people who are trying to get their voices heard, whether they're spreading false information or not. And if you don't have fact-checking, some kind of fact-checking operation around elections, I think it makes it incredibly hard for anybody any voter to get a clear picture of what is actually going on.
In an op-ed published in Le Monde, the chairman of AFP, Fabrice Fries, wrote that removing fact-checking from social media platforms was, and I quote, "a bit like pulling down a fire station during a major fire." Do you agree with that?
Yes, I mean, yes, I do agree with that completely. It's if you just think about how difficult it is for people, particularly with generative AI and the way that people are finding information now, and it's getting more and more broken up and siloed, and it's complicated to verify information. But you need to know that there's somewhere that you can go to try and seek reliable sources. And I think that taking that away or making that even harder, I mean, it makes no sense.
Because, I mean, this is the essence of it too, isn't it? I mean, this is about safeguarding the democracies that we live in as well.
Absolutely. I mean, the efforts that a lot of the misinformation that we've worked on over the years, it's not all deliberately shared. It's not propaganda. A lot of it is just individuals sharing things from a personal point of view. But behind it, they're big operations, propaganda operations from different countries. And that's only got much more visible and much bigger and much more powerful with all the tools that are available now to diffuse that information, whatever it may be. So yes, it is. It's an absolute threat to democracies. And I don't know I think some people say it's an information war.
I'm back on the Paris Metro, en route to my next meeting, one that I've been very much looking forward to. I've been invited to visit a high school on the outskirts of northern Paris and sit up the back of a classroom full of 15-year-olds as they receive a lesson in media literacy from a visiting journalist. The workshop is administered by an organisation called Entre les Lignes, set up by a couple of French journalists back in 2010. Back then, the organisation's aim was to sensitise teenagers to the work of journalists. But over time, its mission has evolved to teach very specific lessons about how teens can spot a fake when they're online. I'm meeting up with Isabelle Worth, a journalist of some 25 years' experience with Agence France Presse, who is among some 150 French journalists who dedicate what little spare time they have to visiting schools and educating the next generation about the importance of seeking out credible information.
Bryce, un confrère journaliste australien.
In the classroom, Isabelle shows students videos of TV news reports and shows how they're manipulated, then posted to social media.
Vous êtes tous d'accord avec cette légende qui a retrouvé cette légende à peu près? Très bien. Moi aussi.
For a group of 15-year-olds, the students are impressively engaged and, perhaps unsurprisingly so. Most of their waking hours in France's famously rigid schooling system are taken up with rote learning of maths formulas and French texts. Here's a moment of instruction that's about TikTok, Snapchat and Instagram, worlds that they're all infinitely more energised by. Sitting in the classroom, I recognise the same high level of engagement among the students as that I've seen in similar workshops I've done in Australian classrooms with our Newshounds program. Isabelle says, as an organisation, Entre les Lignes found its services in especially high demand following the Charlie Hebdo attacks, as educators all over the country struggled to explain to their students the how and the why of the tragedy.
After this attack, some of the teachers said that they were facing children being not able to understand that it was not possible to think that it would be normal to attack just because of a cartoon.
And, most alarmingly, teachers began noticing the impact that misinformation shared in the days and weeks after the attack was having on children's attitudes towards it.
There was some children saying something like, Charlie Hebdo, these people were killed, but they have deserved it. But the problem was the teachers felt not in the capacity to answer, to handle these questions and to find the correct words. So that's why the Media Literacy Association, after the Charlie Hebdo attack, were facing a really high demand to visit schools, to help the teachers to face these situations. In the same time, the French government did reinforce media literacy in the curriculum.
The French government doubled down on mandatory media literacy education in the wake of the Charlie Hebdo attacks in 2015, pouring millions of dollars into teacher training programs and weaving media literacy into every subject in the curriculum.
In the what we call the fourth class, quatrième, classe de quatrième, maybe a third of the curriculum, more or less, in this school year in French is about press media literacy. And the thing is that so the curricula are centralized and of course created, adapted and updated with the help of teachers and professors, but it's centralized, and it means that in every school in France, all the children follow the same curricula. So a lot of media literacy, a lot of lessons about what is press freedom, the legal system was promoted or highlighted.
And charged with the job of ensuring France has a media literate population is a dedicated government agency called CLEMI, the Centre pour l'éducation aux médias et à l'information. The overarching aim of CLEMI is to teach French kids at a very young age the importance of journalism. Through CLEMI, about 30,000 teachers a year receive government-funded media literacy training. Importantly, CLEMI is part of the French Education Ministry, which, according to a recent report in the New York Times, recently doubled its annual budget for media literacy training courses for teachers and added to the national curriculum a high school course on the internet and the media. With all of this in mind, I make my way to a converted school building in a residential pocket of Paris just west of the Eiffel Tower. The director of Clémy, Serge Barbet, and the organisation's head of international partnerships, Laure Desmoulins, are waiting to welcome me. And once again, unprompted, cite the inflection point of the Charlie Hebdo terror attacks. And because our conversation was in French, we've had actors read out a translation.
Oui, alors là on est dans un contexte de crise.
Voilà.
We are at a crisis point.
C'est une matière qui monte de plus en plus. Il y avait les attentats qui ont été une prise de conscience.
It's becoming more and more urgent. The attacks were a wake-up call. Public authorities are very focused on the importance of media education and information, and especially foreign digital interference, generative artificial intelligence, the polarisation of society, and the population's distrust of institutions.
Et donc, la réponse, c'est souvent...
So the answer is media literacy and information literacy. That is to say, educating young people to think critically, to be active citizens, to be able to navigate correctly online, to seek out information, to be able to verify it, to take a position, and to be active citizens online and in real life.
The entire Clémy agency operates with an annual budget of some €6 million, all paid for by the French government because it's understood by lawmakers there that media literacy is not just about not falling victim to mis or disinformation, it's about protecting France's democracy.
Donc nous sommes dans une période où à la fois, pour compléter ce que vient de dire Laure,
we are in a period where our societies are undergoing a complete transformation. There's the evolution of digital information technologies, which we see are weighing on our democracies. We're seeing the rise of political populism. We're clearly seeing the bipolarization of public debate, the retreat of public debate to the extremes.
And when I ask Laure how popular the media literacy courses for teachers are, she points to the large conference room next door to us, filled with educators who have travelled from every corner of France to take part in lessons on how to teach media literacy to their students.
Ils sont tous à côté. Si vous voulez voir qui ils sont.
They're right there in the room next door. You want to see who they are? They're history teachers, geography teachers, lots and lots of French teachers. And instead of media literacy being a subject itself, in France it's what we call transversal. It cuts across all subjects, and in the French curriculum, it's mandatory.
For most of her working life, Juliane von Reppert-Bismarck toiled as a working journalist. As a reporter for the likes of Reuters, Newsweek, Der Spiegel and The Wall Street Journal, she never imagined she'd do anything else. But then Brexit happened. And it was about that time that she noticed an uptick in xenophobia and the amount of misinformation swirling about the stay and leave campaigns. When, on assignment in Germany, she encountered a 13-year-old who parroted a piece of disinformation she'd gleaned from her Instagram account, Juliane knew that her profession, not to mention the very notion of truth, was in danger. And so, she set up Lie Detectors, a non-profit, Europe-wide and journalist-led initiative that helps preteens and teenagers tell news facts from news fakes.
Kids are not helpless, and if you give them tools, they are happy and want to use them. And it's about time that we journalists started handing over our own tools to a generation that's not waiting for the evening broadcast to tell them what's important or what is news or what actually happened. They're actually piecing it together themselves. And to be able to do that, they need basic journalistic tools, basic tools of inquiry. And who better to give those tools to them than journalists?
With programs in Austria, Germany, Belgium, Luxembourg, Switzerland and Poland, Lie Detectors operates in an impressive 5 different languages. It has trained more than 500 journalists across Europe, who volunteer their time to visit classrooms and teach kids how to look through a fake and sniff out the truth.
The teachers are fairly unnerved by the fact that the kids are getting their information from radically different sources compared to their own. We ask them, where do you get your news from? And they'll tell us Twitch, Discord, Fortnite, some of these things are gaming platforms. A lot of these places are encrypted chats small private chat rooms, and all sorts of things can circulate there where content moderation, somebody coming along and checking that everything's fine, just will not penetrate.
Julianne says that while kids are susceptible to fake news and disinformation, let down in no small part by an analogue education system that's ill-suited to the digital age, kids are nevertheless pretty savvy when it comes to online content.
They don't need to be able to say manipulation or propaganda or foreign information interference. They can tell you that content that is sensationalist gets you clicks and clicks get you money, because they don't want to be footballers and pop stars anymore. They want to be influencers, and they know they can get rich that way, and they know how it works. They also know that if they decide to post a nice or an ugly picture of their friend or their frenemy online, they can really influence the way their schoolmates think about things and think about people. So they understand from a very early age that there's money to be made and minds to be influenced. And let's face it, that's what disinformation is all about. Money and influence. And they get that.
And disinformation presumably has the same corrosive effect on democratic processes and institutions in Europe as it does elsewhere around the world.
Yes, we've got a real hollowing out across Europe of the democratic centre. And you really do have people wandering off to the extremes on both sides of the political spectrum. And that's happening across Europe. And we do see that that's also very closely linked to the information that they are consuming, and in particular, the algorithms that have captured their preferences and that are feeding all of us increasingly just the fare that we already like and that we already believe. And that's obviously not good for democracy or anything that's happening in the centre.
The EU member states are renowned, of course, for their love of regulation, and that most certainly extends to the tech sector, even if Julianne is unsure if the existing laws are fit for purpose.
Yes, the EU has come up with a number of tools: the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, the AI Act. The Digital Services Act is getting a lot of attention for several reasons. First of all, it's supposed to hold the large online platforms and advertisers to particular standards, and those standards are content related. We at Lie Detectors are quite skeptical about how far the Digital Services Act can actually succeed, because as soon as you talk about content moderation, what can you put online, what can't you put online, you immediately make yourself vulnerable to accusations of censorship. And there's a self-regulatory or a co-regulatory element to the Digital Services Act, which is called the Code of Practice, which the various signatories are supposed to be adhering to, and X-Left as a signatory. And Facebook, or Meta rather, has told us that, well, they're not going to do any financing of fact-checking anymore, and they're not going to do any of their own fact-checking anyway, because we have freedom of speech to protect.
Better, she says, to change tack, and instead of targeting content, start following the money.
We've really been saying, let's not talk about content. It's not actually addressing the problem. Let's talk about the money behind disinformation. Let's have a look at what is the connection between the advertising revenue business model of the large online platforms, that's also called micro-targeting these days, and the proliferation of viral, polarizing content. And, that kind of a probe, I think, could bring up some very interesting results. And then you could tackle that from the Digital Markets Act. The Digital Markets Act will go at this far more from an antitrust perspective. So far more from a markets perspective. That takes the sting out of anything that's to do with content and censorship and really focuses on following the money.
And, echoing the arguments we've been making here in Australia for government funding of newshounds, our own media literacy program for primary school kids, Julianne says that while we wait for notoriously slow regulators to catch up to tech companies in their nimble ways, mandatory media literacy education is vital, and it needs to have started yesterday.
I must say that I see less optimism for regulation really taking hold and holding the platforms to account in this particular political climate. Europe is so concerned about what the repercussions might be of holding Silicon Valley to account when there is such a symbiosis now between politics and business in the US. So one more reason, and I don't only say that because I run a media literacy organization, but sincerely, one more reason that we can't hang around and wait until regulation really is enforced and has an effect. And we've got to get the kids and absolutely everybody capable of already navigating our online information world, even before the platforms do something to secure this space.
And while advocates maintain teaching a population to think critically about the flood of information it's exposed to every day is increasingly important to the health of our democracies, Julianne says media literacy in the EU is nevertheless in real danger of being politicised by parties who see an advantage in voters only ever getting one side of every story.
We have to be careful how we talk about media literacy these days. It's better to talk about digital literacy because even in the European Union, there are governments that will bristle at the idea of giving children media literacy skills because they consider that to be opposition work. So we have to be really careful and always insist that we do not have a political agenda, that what we are attempting to do is give children, but all citizens, in fact, the tools to make informed decisions.
And can you just unpack that a little for me? So there are governments in Europe that bristle at the concept of media literacy because they worry that it's the work of the opposition?
Sure. I don't think it's it's a secret that politicians will work with bending the facts a little bit to make sure that people are voting in the way that they would like them to vote. And, if you're media literate and you are looking at both sides of the story, well, you might not be quite as easily persuaded. And that is not to everybody's liking. There are, of course, governments and political actors who would much rather prefer that you only hear their voice. And that's why we have to be a little bit careful. We do have to talk about digital skills, digital literacy.
Of course, Europe's politicians are not the only threat posed to the teaching of digital literacy across the continent. Elon Musk has had a hand too in the destabilising of programs and organisations trying to inoculate populations from disinformation. In his capacity as the head of the US government's Department of Government Efficiency, aka DOGE, and before his bromance with President Trump spectacularly unravelled, Musk announced a wholesale defunding of many millions of dollars worth of foreign aid delivered through the USAID agency. In July, as the full impact of those cuts took hold, both former President Obama and Bush warned of the chilling effect the cuts would have on America's claim to the title of world superpower, even as Secretary of State Marco Rubio followed through on the work that Elon had started, cancelling 83% of USAID's overseas programs and announcing that ultimately it would be replaced by another agency, this one called America First. And for Julianne's lie detectors, the effect has been immediate.
We are getting emails from like-minded organizations that we like to talk to. We like to think about how we can partner with them, cooperate with them, particularly on the eastern fringes of the European Union, Bulgaria, Romania, Czech Republic, Slovakia. And these are organizations that will contact us and they will say, look, we've got a call scheduled in, but we don't know whether we're still going to be around, because they've been funded by USAID and USAID has pulled out. And this is, felt very keenly. And media literacy often goes hand in hand with fact-checking, and the fact-checkers have been bankrolled to a very large extent by Meta over the years. And, Meta saying they're no longer going to be doing that and no longer going to be financing that, that has a real chilling impact on Europe's ability, at this level of these organizations that rely on that funding to do their job and to secure Europe from what does come in from the eastern fringes, let's face it. The sort of thing that does really influence the voting patterns and the belief patterns of countries that are very close to Russia.
In the face of these rising threats, it's up to governments, according to Julian, to act swiftly to overhaul the school systems in their countries to make media literacy as vital a part of each child's education as reading, writing, and arithmetic.
Media literacy, or shall we say digital literacy, should be something that is considered a basic literacy, a core literacy alongside reading and writing and counting. The ability to check whether what you're reading is actually true or whether what you're seeing is actually true. Media literacy and the guarantees media literacy affords to our democracy is such a big responsibility. It is not one to hand over, for instance, to profit-driven and largely unregulated corporations and online platforms.
Join me next episode as I hop across the channel to London to see how the Guardian Foundation is educating Britain's youth about media literacy and meet the English professors leading the fight there against disinformation. This podcast has been made possible by the Winston Churchill Trust Australia. I'm Bryce Corbett. Thanks for listening to episode 5 of The Big Threat.